Hey guys! So this activity illustrates something called privilege, which is the idea that some people simply have an advantage over others in certain situations. So some people would feel guilty about having privilege because they understand that they have an advantage and they just want the world to be fair to everyone. So for example, this is how I felt when I was in South Africa, and I realized how much higher the typical American standard of living was than the majority of South Africans and their living standard. As you can see in the picture, this is the township I worked in for a summer, and what you see here expanded for miles and miles and miles and miles of these little rundown huts. And I felt really guilty that I had been born in the US while the students I was teaching there had been born into this very violent and very poor situation. And I'm sure many of you can relate to moments of guilt like that in your life. Now, on the other hand, some people might feel defensive about having privilege because they think that others might assume that they never had to work hard for something or that everything was just given to them. So for example, I felt this way when a friend who had really bad stage fright got upset when I got a better grade than him on a public speaking assignment. And I had worked really, really, really hard on that speech, and I was hurt that he seemed to imply that it was just super easy for me to get that good grade, right? I was defensive, and I'm sure many of you can relate to that kind of feeling as well. So it turns out that both of these things, the guilt and the defensiveness, are both legitimate feelings, but both of them can be harmful and can be untrue at times. So for example, it is not my fault that I was born in the US instead of South Africa, so there is nothing to feel guilty about. That guilt just kind of weighs down on you and makes you feel really bad, and that's not helpful. And it's also not my fault that I was born without stage fright, and that compared to other people, I've never really struggled with talking in front of people. So either way, guilty or defensive, you can't help having privilege. It's not your fault. The goal here isn't to point fingers one way or the other. The goal here is to replace guilt with gratitude. Like, instead of feeling guilty, I'm just super, super grateful that I was born in the US and that I have a really nice standard of living compared to a lot of places in the world. And like replacing defensiveness with compassion. So for example, instead of being upset with my friend who was questioning my hard work on that public speaking assignment, I put myself in his shoes and realized that I might have had to work super hard to get my speech to be awesome, but he had to do that and deal with a paralyzing fear of getting up and talking in front of people while being graded by a really mean, scary professor. And that isn't easy. That's not easy. So just because someone points out one advantage that you might have, it doesn't suddenly mean that you've never had to work for anything. That's not what's being implied here. It's just a practice in being compassionate. So privilege is a really good thing to understand because everyone has it in one way, shape, or form. You might have it because it's easy for you to socialize with people, which isn't easy for everyone. Or maybe you have it with how good your hand-eye coordination is, which is super difficult for some people. So privilege is really easy to ignore, and it's very difficult to talk about and uncomfortable to talk about because it means you have to talk about the differences between people, which can get kind of awkward, especially when it comes to things like race or gender or sexuality or ability or whatever it is that separates us. It can be difficult to talk about those differences. But the truth is, we're all different, right? Which we all know. And that's awesome. It's awesome to be different. So instead of denying those differences and pretending we're all colorblind, I vote that we actually learn about all of the colors of the rainbow and analyze the differences and understand the world better because we know that we're different and it's cool with us. No rainbow color is better than any other, but they are all different and they all have different properties. Like my analogy there? See where I'm going with this? So at the end of the day, even though it's not our fault that privilege exists, it is something that all of us need to learn how to deal with. This means that we have to acknowledge where we have privilege and to not feel guilty or defensive about it. And it also means that we need to acknowledge where other people might have privileges and to not make them feel guilty or defensive about it. Because none of us can help it at all. And the only thing that makes us feel guilty about these differences and these privileges is listening to each other. If we actually hear each other's stories and experiences without judging them and without feeling judged, we get to learn more about the world and create a more peaceful environment for everyone, just by listening, just listening to other people's experiences. So this brings us back to the conversation we had about empathy at, I don't know, a few months ago in advisory. Just because you might have it worse than someone else doesn't mean that their struggles don't matter. They do. But on the flip side, if you're just constantly complaining about your own struggles without ever checking in on people around you, you're ignoring their experiences, which is also not cool. So listen is the bottom line. So to summarize, I want you all to understand that you have privilege. All of you, even just the fact that you go to New Tech and have access to education and technology every single day, that is a huge, huge advantage over so much of the world. So even just acknowledging that you all have privilege, and you shouldn't feel guilty or defensive about that. That's totally fine. But that is a privilege that you all have. And then there's also the privilege of your sex or your gender or your sexuality or your skin color or so many other things. And it's just good to understand what white skin could mean in terms of advantages. Not that it makes it good or bad, but just to understand it is a really, really healthy thing. And if you're ever confronted with something that you don't think is a privilege, consider this. Privilege is when you think something is not a problem because it's not a problem to you personally. And I think that speaks volumes for how a lot of us approach the world. Oftentimes, if it's not a problem to us, it doesn't even cross our minds as a problem. So when someone else might say, hey, that's actually not fair to me, you're like, whatever, you're just complaining. But they're not. That's a legitimate problem for them. So instead of pushing it aside, just listen to their experience. In other words, don't be like this guy. Don't be like him. He's not cool. All right, that is all I have to say about privilege. I hope you enjoy the conversation to follow. D-Step out.